That's Carlo Ancelotti. So often he's painted as a man manager above all else, but here he is, mid-match, reaching for the tactics board. Such was the challenge that Japan posed that the Seleção found themselves constantly tweaking in and out of possession, right across the 90 minutes. So what tactics were on display, and how did Brazil eventually come out on top? Some of the most interesting adaptations actually came when Japan had the ball. When they were building from deep, and from the goal kicks in particular, they operated in an extremely wide back three. Not the lopsided back three that you would usually see from teams in this formation, where one of the wider centre-backs slides out into a fullback position. No, this was a genuinely wide back three, and the aim was to manipulate Brazil's defensive shape. Occasionally, we did see Brazil press with a narrow front three, in a shape closer to a traditional 4-3-3, but for the most part, Vinicius operated quite centrally, with Cunha dropping a little bit deeper behind him, and Ryan from the right often coming narrow to help press the centre-backs. And this led to massive issues, because it meant Brazil frequently only had one man deep on either flank, because down the left, Lucas Paqueta was handed a hybrid role, where he'd have to stay in the midfield to stop a dropping Japanese forward getting on the ball, and half be ready to jump out to press the wing back or the wider centre back. While on the other side, the winger was just narrow. So what this meant is that Japan were perfectly placed to manipulate the wide areas. If the wider centre back got on the ball, it wasn't particularly difficult to find the wing back. And from there, it came down to Brazil's own fullbacks. If the fullback stayed deep, pinned by a Japan forward, the wingback could then receive and simply drive up the pitch, getting into the final third essentially unchallenged. But if the fullback was more front-footed instead, looking to stop the threat at the source, now they'd left a gaping hole behind them for Japan's winger or even the wingback to run into, allowing them to potentially get into dangerous positions. So why did Brazil press in this non-traditional shape to begin with? Well, in a traditional 4-3-3, Casemiro would have been asked to cover a ton of ground. So by keeping Cunha a touch deeper, more in line with Bruno Guimaraes, provided that Paqueta could stay tucked in, Brazil would have a pseudo-double pivot, sitting in front of the backline and ready to cover the gaps behind Guimaraes and Cunha, meaning that Casemiro would have less ground to cover. But all of that only held up if the ball into the right centre-back was consistently cut out. And when this shape worked, you got situations like this. Vinicius and the winger press onto Japan's backline, and you can see Ryan's curved run has actually cut out the left centre-back. At the same time, Cunha and Bruno Guimaraes are on the Japan double pivot, who are now inaccessible. This allows Casemiro to focus on the dropping forward, and at the same time, Paqueta in this hybrid position can easily cover the wide areas or step into the more central areas as well. But all of this quickly fell apart whenever Japan were able to bypass the initial press, especially down that right-hand side. Because once the right centre-back got onto the ball, Paqueta kept getting drawn up and out, and the end result was the same as before. Casemiro left with an enormous amount of ground to cover. So, because Japan were having so much success here, what we saw in the second half once Endrick came on was Brazil change their pressing shape into something closer to a 4-2-3-1 at times, with Vinicius off the left and Ryan off the right, so that now when the ball went to a wider centre-back, Brazil could apply more even pressure on either side. But there were still quirks to the defensive shape, of course. Japan were operating with a front three, supplemented by those wing-backs, so there was always the risk of this front five overloading Brazil's back four. The way Ancelotti looked to cope with this was by now using Casemiro in a hybrid position. He'd start here, while Marquinhos and Gabriel could spread a little wider, so that if the ball came into the midfield, Casemiro could still step up as a traditional forward. But from here, he could just as easily drop into the backline to form a back five, leaving Brazil man-to-man against Japan's front line. And for the most part, this was an effective adaptation. But there were always those risks in transitional moments, because if Casemiro was caught slightly higher when the centre-backs had pushed wider, there was space for Japan to run into. But generally, as the match wore on, Japan grew more and more passive, which meant Brazil had less and less actual defending to do. Of course, Brazil's changes weren't only out of possession, and to get the full context of this tactical encounter, we need to look at them with the ball as well. But just before we do, if you want to improve your tactical understanding of the beautiful game, check out Football Fundamentals, a free 30-day program I've designed to teach you the basics of analysis, so you can go from just watching the game to doing the analysis yourself. It's available for free through the link down in the description. Initially, Brazil were looking to build with a traditional back four, and Japan, for their part, was situationally aggressive with their press. Every backwards pass, every poor touch, was an opportunity for them to apply as much pressure as they possibly could. But we've seen throughout this tournament that Japan like to operate as a unit. When they press, they all press. When they sit in a mid-block, the whole team is in that mid-block. And when they're deep, the entire team is deep. It's all done to minimize the spaces between the lines and keep them in control of as many crucial zones on the pitch as possible. When they sat deeper, their shape often looked like this: a back five with a compact front five ahead of them, arranged in a 2-3. And it was essential that this front five stayed compact because they wanted to protect the middle. This was even more important than usual here because Brazil were building with something of a lopsided diamond, with Cunha tending to drop in and Casemiro operating deepest as the solo pivot. There were advantages to this for Brazil. By having only one midfielder deep and so many men high up the pitch, there was always the potential to find a man between the lines. But with Japan so compact and so willing to commit numbers forward on the transition, whenever the play broke down for Brazil, Casemiro often found himself completely under-supported. And that allowed Japan to run through on the transition fairly easily, which led to several dangerous situations. Now yes, at times, Brazil were able to penetrate that central five, but the most important thing for Japan was making sure that no man was ever allowed to turn inside the defensive shape, because when a Brazil player did manage to turn, that led to easy progression, as well as shooting opportunities. But whenever Japan could get the pressure on, they were more than happy to force Brazil to play backwards. But one of the biggest tactical changes from Ancelotti was the role of the fullbacks. Early on, Santos operated high on the left-hand side, while Danilo stayed deep, almost as a third centre-back on occasion. The left-back's positioning allowed Vinicius and Cunha to both operate much more narrowly, which helped to increase their central overload. Vinicius would often look to drop deep to pick up the ball, although the Japanese centre-back was usually able to follow him deep and stop him turning, exactly as we discussed. But as the match wore on, more and more we saw Danilo operate much like Santos, pushing high down the right, and this now allowed Ryan to tuck inside. And this had several benefits. Firstly, there was now an extra man between the lines, which made the combination play far easier because Brazil were now heavily overloading Japan through the middle. On top of that, with so many fluid bodies in the front line, when the likes of Vinicius dropped deep and dragged a centre-back deep with him, there were now more willing runners to move into the space beyond him. But perhaps the biggest benefit was just how much harder it made Japan's front five work, as they kept shifting between that 5-2-3 and the 5-4-1. With both fullbacks now high, when Brazil worked the ball into wide areas, the fullback on the opposite side, rather than sitting deep, could pick up the ball in these advanced regions. And because Japan had become so passive defensively, Brazil could afford to commit more and more numbers into the box. The result was you'd see the likes of Danilo arriving down the right, and that, ultimately, is what cost Japan the match. A tightly contested knockout encounter, but I want to know, just how far do you think Brazil will go in this tournament after watching that? Drop it down below. And for your next video, if you want to look at the tactics behind the greatest World Cup final in history, check out this video right here. And don't forget to sign up for Football Fundamentals first through the link down below.